Well, for those of you who've just joined us in the past few minutes, welcome to Making Sense of Suffering, hosted by Baptist Bible Seminary at Clark Summit University. In a moment, I'm going to introduce Wayne Slusser. He is professor of New Testament and Greek at CSU and at the seminary. But before we get to that, I just want to let you know that this is an evening where we are going to discuss a biblical approach and practical approach or response to suffering. There will be a Q&A time after the presentation. And if you have questions, I invite you to ask those in the chat, and I will make sure that those get answered at the end of our time together. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Wayne Slusser, who beyond just being a professor here at the seminary is also our women's soccer coach, and they just had an excellent game yesterday. So Coach Slusser, if you would take it from here.
Sure. Thank you, James. Appreciate it. Welcome, everybody. As James has said, we really appreciate you being here, taking the time to walk through this topic with us. Let me introduce to you the seminary faculty that will be with us. I will introduce them to you in the order that they will be speaking. So David Gunn, Professor David Gunn, if you will, okay, he raised his hand there. He is our professor of systematic theology. He will be helping us understand it, obviously, from a theological standpoint. And then Professor Mark McGinnis, if you raise your hand, he is our Old Testament professor. He will give us the final response, and I'm really looking forward to what he has to say, and you all learning his journey, a personal journey, and how he practically responds to suffering. I think you're all going to have an opportunity, like James has said, to ask questions, and we're happy to answer those. I will turn it over to Professor Gunn, and then we will get started. Thank you again for being here. This is great to have this number of people, and for sure you all know this or you wouldn't be here, and that is this is very applicable to today. And so we appreciate you being here. Professor Gunn, take it away, sir.
All right, thank you, Wayne. So we're talking about making sense of suffering. And as others have already said, this is a very relevant topic, because human suffering is a universal part of the human experience. I think it's fair to say that suffering is in some sense ubiquitous. That is, it's everywhere, and suffering is in some sense persistent. Everyone who lives out their days upon this planet will experience suffering or will encounter suffering at one point or another. Sorry to break it to you, that's bad news. It is just the way that it is. And so all worldviews, all doctrinal approaches to the world, all philosophical approaches to the world must come up with some kind of an explanation for the existence and the persistence of human suffering. Must deal with the fact that this is how we encounter the world. One of the areas that I do a lot of reading and writing and teaching in is Christian apologetics. And a lot of times in that arena, we find that critics of the Christian perspective, critics of the Christian worldview, will often say that the existence and persistence of suffering is one of the great weaknesses of our faith. That is to say, critics will say that if God is omnipotent, if God is all-powerful, then he could prevent or eliminate human suffering. And they will assert that if God is omnibenevolent, that is, if he is all good, if he wills the best for us, then he would prevent or eliminate human suffering. And yet he does not. So skeptics and critics will sometimes ask one of these two questions, or possibly both of them. First of all, why didn't God create a world without suffering? Or why doesn't God create a world without suffering? And of course, critics of Christianity are not the only ones who have ever raised those questions, or at least thought them. I suspect everyone who has ever found themselves in a moment of existential angst, or who has felt the experience of being in deep suffering, has at one time or another thought something very close to one of those two questions. Why, God, are you allowing this to happen to me? Why, God, did you not just create the world devoid of suffering in the first place? Or why don't you create a world in which suffering is not something that we must wrestle with and experience? Well, in seeking to think through the topic of suffering and make sense of it theologically, it seems to me that the Christian worldview gives us answers to both of those questions. They're not the answers perhaps that we like or that we're always prepared to receive, but I think they are the correct answers, and they are the answers that help us to make sense of suffering. The answer to that first question, why didn't God create a world without suffering? Well, the answer is he did. The Christian doctrine of creation teaches that in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, and he created this world precisely such as we would want to live in it. It was a world devoid of pain, devoid of sorrow, devoid of sickness and disease and death. In short, it was a world without suffering. And the Bible furthermore teaches that it was we who wrecked everything, took it off the rails almost immediately. You can think of a father who turns over the keys to the car to his excited teenage son, and his son goes out and fires up the car and drives it out and immediately crashes it into a concrete divider. And now the car is totaled. Kind of an illustration for what God essentially did with us and the world, entrusting the world to humankind, saying, here is my creation, you are to rule over this. I give it into your care. And immediately by falling, by sinning, by rebelling against God, we messed everything up. This teaches us at least two things. First, it teaches us that it was we who brought suffering into the world and not God. It would, of course, be ludicrous for our proverbial teenage son to sort of come storming back into the house and start yelling at his father, right? And blaming him for the fact that the car is totaled. Well, you did that, dude. That's kind of how you would respond to that. In the same way, I think we tend to commit a major blunder when we blame the existence of suffering on God, or when we fail to acknowledge that humankind is responsible for the entry of suffering into this world. Now, I should quickly hasten to add that that's not to say that every specific instance of suffering is attributable to a specific instance of human sin. Not at all. That would be the error of Job's three friends, for example. Job, you're suffering, you must have committed some great sin. And of course, that's wrong. Jesus' disciples fall into that way of thinking at one point as well. Lord, who sinned that this man was born blind? And Jesus says, well, your whole thinking is off in this area. So Christianity does not teach that every instance of suffering is the result of a specific act of sin. So that if you're here today and you're suffering, that doesn't mean that your suffering is necessarily your fault. Rather, what Christianity teaches is that the whole state of affairs in which suffering exists is ultimately attributable to our collective rebellion against God. So it is we who brought suffering into the world, not God. And second, it teaches us that the world is broken. To go back to our illustration of the teenage boy in the car, it's not like he just got into a little fender bender, right? And he can bring the car back home, pull it into his driveway and sort of work on it, maybe buff out some of the scratches, hammer out some of the dents, and everything will be just fine. No, the car is totaled. It is wrecked beyond the capacity of laymen to fix it. And so it is with our world. I think the best theologies and the best philosophies are the ones that deal with that fact head on, rather than trying to fluff it off or sort of just say, well, it's not as bad as it appears to be. No, it is as bad as it appears to be. The world is completely and totally broken, and hence we have things like suffering. Here's how Paul puts it in Romans chapter 8. We know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit, we groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. So all of the world order has been subjected to this broken state of affairs. And the world now is not the way that the world is supposed to be. If that's all that we had to say about suffering, if that's all that we had to say about the way that the world is, then that would be a rather bleak message, wouldn't it? Fortunately, that's not all that the Christian worldview has to say. If we've answered the question now, why didn't God create a world without suffering? We need to move on to that second question. Why doesn't God create a world without suffering? And here too, biblical Christianity has an answer. And that answer is, he will. Christians believe that ever since the fall, God has been executing a plan that will culminate in the recreation of a perfect world. And part of thinking Christianly about suffering is learning to recognize that we have not reached the destination yet. There's an interesting passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 where Paul is talking about suffering. And he has the temerity, you might even think the unmitigated gall, to characterize suffering as this light momentary affliction, which, if you're in the midst of suffering, you'll probably bristle at that characterization, right? What does he think? How dare Paul characterize human suffering in this sort of flippant, cavalier way? Light momentary affliction. My suffering is debilitating. Well, the reason Paul is able to use that description to describe suffering is that he is looking at the issue of human suffering from an eternal perspective and from an eschatological perspective. Here's how his remarks read more fully. He says, this light momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison as we look not to the things that are seen. That's what you and I do most naturally. But Paul says we do not look to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. So this perspective that Paul gives us on suffering, you could summarize like this. In the light of eternity, in the light of what Christ will do when he returns, we can understand suffering to be a light momentary affliction. Now, that does not take the suffering away. Of course not. But I think what that does is it enables us to put suffering in its proper context and to understand suffering in its proper context. Suffering is hard. Suffering is rough. Suffering is at times seemingly unbearable and debilitating. But Paul's point and the Christian outlook on things are this: suffering is all of those things, but suffering is also transitory. And a new day and a better day is coming. So this world is not the way it's supposed to be. But at the same time, the world is not the way it always will be. I'll conclude with these brief comments by the Apostle John as he is describing his vision of what will take place hereafter. He writes in Revelation 21, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no more sea. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God.'" And then here's the kicker right here in verse 4. "He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. And he who was seated on the throne said, 'Behold, I am making all things new.'" So suffering is rough. Suffering is real because the world is broken. But the message of Jesus is that he will not leave the world in this broken state, but he will come again and redeem the world to himself. And that, I think, is the proper Christian theological outlook on suffering. So having said all of that, I will turn things over to Dr. Slusser.
Thank you, David. Appreciate your time there. Let me read a couple of things to you that I have in my notes, and you can kind of guess where I'm going with this. Commit to well-doing. Stand fast in the grace of God. Both of those are verses from chapter 4 and chapter 5 of the book of 1 Peter. And I think if we're going to go anywhere to discuss suffering, I think that would be a good place to start. I was given a summary, I guess you could say a phrase that summarizes 1 Peter. back doing my doctoral work, Dr. Bill Arp gave me this phrase, and I think it captures the book of First Peter, as well as it helps us understand even further how how all of us as believers can approach this topic. He makes this phrase, he says, living holy in a hostile world. So there's no doubt that there's hostility surrounding us. So as believers, we confront this, maybe not daily, but for sure we confront this in a way that, it can be difficult. It can be difficult to live a life that's God honoring. It can be difficult to hear the ridicule, to hear those that, if you want to use it this way, make fun of us. They very much understand who we are. So that's potentially why we go through what we go through. That's very similar to the recipients of First Peter. They also were put in an environment, if we could word it this way, they were put in an environment where they were not wanted. They were put in an environment where people persecuted them and ridiculed them, again, for what reason? Because of their identity. So if we look to First Peter, I want to answer 3 questions that I think will capture all of the book, and we can see where we might fit and how we can, again, approach this topic. The first question is, who are we? So Peter begins chapter 1 through basically halfway through chapter 2. He answers the identity component. We are believers, and we're believers because of what Christ has done on our behalf through a gracious God. So chapter 1, verse 3, I find very helpful to think through, especially when those difficult times rise. And he says that we have a living hope. So if we are identified as a believer, we are a Christian, we are to be hopeful people. That hope there, that's rooted in the grace of God, which is just precious. It's his merciful character that has blessed us with salvation, the fact that we can be rightly related to God. And chapter 2 also mentions that we belong to God. Again, that's encouraging, because the God of all heaven, the God who created everything, the heavens and the earth and all that is in them, we belong to him. And one day, right, we have a future, chapter 2, verse 9, that future that one day we will be vindicated. And so we are that special people, his possession, if you will. And he gives a command in chapter 1, also verse 13. He says that we are to eagerly hope. We look forward to with confidence. It's not something that we hope, oh, I hope of this or that will happen today. It's a confidence that we know that because God's behind it and it's his plan, that indeed something's going to happen. And what is that something? Obviously vindication, but it's based on something that's outside of us. It's based on Christ's death, burial, and resurrection. So that's done. That's finished. And so that gives us that hope, something that we can confidently look toward, that one day we'll be with him for sure. And as we move on through the letter, chapters 1 and 2, let me state it this way. They set a foundation. And then because of who we are, how can I live life? And why do I go through the life of suffering or difficulty that I do? Well, for sure, the answer why is because of who we are. We're believers. But then how do I do that? I think that's kind of where he lands in the middle chapters, chapter 2 through chapter 4. And it's interesting because in chapter 2, verse 11, he begins, dearly beloved. So here's that intimate address, if you will, to believers, to encourage them with the difficulty that they are obviously enduring, and then potentially how can we use what Peter says to also go through that suffering. So not only who are we, but the second question I think Peter's answering is, what are we to do? So based on my identity now, what's my responsibility? And again, I think chapters 2 through chapter 4, he mentions, I think he communicates this point. We are to be committed people. We're to be hopeful people because of who we are. Now, because of who we are, we're to be committed. And he mentions in chapter 2, verse 11, he talks about us being honorable, or having our conduct that's honorable, having our conduct that's good. So it's a conduct, if you want to phrase it this way, it's a conduct that even unbelievers appreciate as good and honorable. Why? Well, because that good and that honorable conduct includes being lovely, being gracious, being kind, being excellent. It ultimately, what does the rest of that verse say? That it points people to glorify God. So we have an incredible responsibility. And then again, as you move into chapter 3, well, the phrase and the verse that we're all familiar with, right? Be ready always to give an answer of the hope that lies within us. Well, that hope has been put there by a gracious and merciful God through Christ, and we've been changed. That's our identity. So as we move on to chapter 4, I can't help but look at chapter 4, verse 1, when he says, arm yourself with Christ's mindset. And the interesting thing that I've been able to kind of grab and capture through reading First Peter is each time Peter gives several admonitions or exhortations or imperatives, commands, how to live life that's holy, again, in a world full of hostility, he backs it up by talking about Christ's suffering as an example of how did Christ respond? What was Christ's response? How did he live life? What is it that he went through? Providing us an example and a model of how we too can go through our difficulty. So we have, when we say to arm ourselves, when we say to have Christ's mindset, I think we're communicating this similar intention, this similar resolve as Christ. Our response should be one of steadfast hope for that one day vindication that even Professor Gunn talked about. It's a fear of God. It's a commitment to live in such a way, again, live in such a way that others see the grace of God. And that's the preciousness, if you will, that Peter is trying to communicate, that you all have been so changed by something completely outside of you. And it's that's following you all of these days, and you can rest in that grace, again, because of your right relationship with Christ. And in chapter 4, verse 2, also, it's the day-to-day conduct that we have to the will of God and how we are to live daily, again, because of who we are. So there's a commitment that Peter's pushing them toward that ought to represent, again, who we are. Now, the last one, I think, in chapter 4 and chapter 5, why are we to do it? So who are we? Well, we're hopeful people. We're identified with Christ. We're believers. And then what is my responsibility? Well, I'm going to arm myself with Christ's mindset, and I'm going to be committed. And I'm going to be a committed follower, again, based on the grace of God that he's given us. And what's difficult with that conduct, right? And Peter walks through all those relationships, our conduct with the government, our conduct with our place of job, our jobs there, and then also in our home with wives and husbands. Not suggesting, and neither is Peter, that any of that is easy. We're suggesting that it's made possible because of the grace of Christ. Again, that's changed you. Now, why are we to do it? I kind of phrase this the reality component in chapter 4 and chapter 5. And the reality of it is we are a blessed people. That's who we are. We, in chapter 4, verses 12 and 13, we have, Peter says, the likelihood that we're going to suffer. And you could say it this way: suffering is to be expected. And should suffering come our direction, Peter says, you are blessed. I think he's wording it this way: you are blessed not because you're going through it, but because the Spirit of the glory of God rests upon you. So our willingness to suffer, if you want to say it this way, rather than compromise, indicates the inner transformation of the sanctifying work of the Spirit. The Spirit's doing his work on our hearts so that it doesn't look like God has abandoned us, because he hasn't. To the contrary, God's powerfully present in the experience of our suffering. So we can rest in that grace. We can rest in the presence of God through the difficulty. Again, that doesn't, as David said, it doesn't move the suffering away. But what it does, I think, is it enables us to go through it knowing who's on our side. So if we suffer, we glorify God. We openly recognize and acknowledge that we have faith in God. One author put it this way: be more concerned with your standing with God than your standing with this society. And I've appreciated that because we are placing our trust and our confidence in God. That's who ultimately sees us through the suffering and gives us the ability to walk through it. Again, I'm not suggesting it's easy per se. I'm suggesting that we have somebody as powerful as the Spirit working within our life that helps us walk through it. God will settle you. Chapter 5, verse 10, he'll settle you. He'll strengthen you. He'll secure you. Kind of gives you that empowerment, if you will, to stand firm, even though things seem to be changing around us. So I'll end with this. And I think Peter, right, an incredible task, for one thing, to write a letter to a people group that's suffering as they are. But he always points them back to Christ and who it is that they are. But I love how he ends the letter. Peter says, with this grace in view, you're empowered for faithfulness to Christian living. Now stand in it. So as we think through how we can walk through it, I really want to hear what Dr. McGinnis has to say, because he is walking through it presently, his suffering. And I think you all will be encouraged that the foundation for him walking through that, obviously, is his relationship with Christ and the grace that he receives every day from the Creator. Go ahead, Professor McGinnis.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Dr. Slesser. You've heard, Professor Gunn talk about the theological reality of suffering. You heard Dr. Slesser talk about us suffering as Christians for our faith. Now I'm going to move towards the personal one, and that's the two out of the three areas we suffer. We suffer because we live in a sin-sick world, diseases, and we suffer because we're Christians, and we also suffer because we're sinners and we do sinful things. Okay, we get drunk, we wreck the car. You're going to suffer. We're not going to talk about that suffering. We're going to talk about suffering that's part and parcel of the sin-sick world, where we get diseases, where bad things do happen to good people. And my story, well, it started long ago, but my suffering really started, at least what I'm dealing with now, in 2010. I have what they call trigeminal neuralgia, or TN. It's the second worst pain known to medical science. Only cluster headaches are worse. I don't want to argue with any moms on our Zoom call tonight, but I'm told that it's worse than labor pains. Now, I know some of you moms say, hey, I'll argue with you. I don't want to do that. My wife's had 5 kids, and I'm not going to argue with her either. But it's worse than kidney stones, and it's worse than pregnancy, they tell us. This is the second worst pain known to medical science. I've had that since 2010. I generally do not go half hour to an hour without some kind of jolt. And you'll notice when I get a jolt, either I'll cry out or you'll see my head jolt. And what's happening, trigeminal affects the largest cranial nerve in my face. So there's 3 branches of it, down the medial, down the top, and up front, and I'll get a jolt of lightning. It feels like somebody's taking jumper cables and putting them to my face. And it feels like a thunderstorm is just exploding in my face. I've had 5 surgeries, 5 brain surgeries to correct it. As a matter of fact, you probably know one of my surgeons was Dr. Ben Carson. Dr. Carson dealt with trigeminal patients like me before he decided to do something different and run for president. So that's why I lost him as my surgeon. But he wasn't able to fix me. And then it took another 5 surgeries after that to fix some complications. So ever since 2010, I've dealt every hour with some kind of pain. It just determines how many times I'll get jolted. I used to, early on, count how many jolts I got. When I got to 150, I decided to stop counting because that was too discouraging. So now I don't count. It could be a few jolts an hour. It can be a few jolts every 10 minutes. It could be a few jolts every minute. Talking, eating, anything my face does, like talking, drinking, eating, can affect it. Even music, amplified sound comes across, hits my face, I can get jolted. Sunday morning is some of the worst. because of the amplified sound. If I touch, if my wife kisses me, if I kiss her, I can get jolted just like that. So I've been living this to 2010. And it's a rare disease. Not many have it. It affects more women than men. And generally it affects only one side of a person's face. I'm one of the unique ones, that male that get it. And number two, I have it on both sides of my face. So I can get it on the left side or the right side. So it's somewhat unique. And as Dr. Carson said, Mark, there's something unique about you. I said, yeah, my mom said the same thing, but I don't think that's what you mean by being unique. So he said, I can't fix you. All right, so now that sets up a dilemma, and now we're back to what Professor Gunn talked about. Lewis calls it the problem of pain. And let me read the quote he says. If God were good, he would wish to make his creatures perfectly happy. And if God were almighty, he'd be able to do what he wished. But the creatures aren't happy. Therefore, God lacks either goodness or power or both. This is the problem of pain in its simplest form. And we all felt that. And we may not admit it, but there are times we do wonder, hey, if God is all loving and all powerful, why doesn't he stop my suffering? He can heal me. We believe that. We worship the God who raised Jesus from the dead. We worship the God of the Exodus. So why he has the power, why doesn't he do it? Maybe he doesn't love me. Yeah, but God so loved the world. So this is what Lewis is the problem of pain. See, I don't think it's a problem of pain at all. I think it's a problem of faith. You see, because we're stuck with this tension about God. And what do we do with God? And folks, I'll tell you from personal experience and from watching others who suffer pain or just disappointment with God, and this pain could either be emotional or physical, is that pain and suffering always attacks our view of God. If you hear nothing else tonight, realize this: pain and suffering always attacks our view of God. Rabbi Kushner was a rabbi who had a son, Aaron, who had progeria. And progeria is a rare disease that hits the victim and he ages rapidly. So his 6-year-old boy was actually like a 70-year-old man. And as his son was going through this, the rabbi started thinking about suffering. He looked at suffering in his son. He looked at suffering in the world. As a Jew, he looked at the Holocaust. He looked at cancer. And his conclusions are written in the best-selling book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. You probably heard the title of that book. His conclusion is this: God can't be everywhere at the same time. So in suffering, he wrings his hands like the rest of us. See, this is what happens when we deal with suffering. We have to take God down from his God position and make him something less. Just this week, I read an article. I tend not to read entertainment stuff, but because it said this person became an atheist, I had to read it. And you might have heard of this entertainer. I have not seen her, just heard the name, Britney Spears. Anybody have heard of Britney Spears? Supposedly she's a believer. Well, she came out this week and said she's an atheist. And that just got my interest. Why? And she said this: the way my family, my dad, and my brothers have treated me have shown me that there is no God. Because if there was a God, he wouldn't let me be treated this way. See, whenever we're affected with pain and suffering, it attacks our view of God. And that's what it did to the rabbi. That's what it did to Brittany. And we're challenged is, what will you do with your view of God? And see, this is where I think we have to go back to the story of Job. And Job is a man who had much more pain than I did based on what you read about in the book of Job. And God allowed him to be struck by Satan because it goes back to what Dr. Slesser had said, was that, can God trust suffering, his glory, in the hands of suffering man? Or will man drop God like a hot potato? See, in the book of Job, Satan sets up this wager with God and says, man only worships you because of what he can get out of it. They see you, God, as a divine vending machine. As long as they put their coins of worship in the vending machine, as long as you keep giving out blessings, they'll worship you. But if they put their coins of worship in and they don't get anything out, what will they do to that vending machine? Not that any of you have ever done this, but you've seen your friends do it, right? What do they do to a vending machine? They put their money in and don't get something out. They look around, make sure no one's watching, and they shake the machine or they kick it. We've heard those stories. Satan said, do it to Job, and he'll drop you. And Job questions God's goodness, his love, and his power. And it's not till chapter 38 to 42 when God has to give him a two-part science lesson and says, well, wait a minute, whose God's here? Is it you or me? Can you order the universe the way I do? And Job says, no, I can't. At that point, Job realizes that God is God and he is not. And at this point, it's critical for Job. Either he has to raise his faith to say God is the God of Job 38 to 42, or he is not. See, and this is what one commentator has said about the book. We can either raise our faith to trust God or lower our view of God to something less than he is God himself. And all of us, whenever we suffer, we have this dynamic play out. Is what will I do with God? Because it's Lewis, as much as I appreciate Lewis, it's not a problem of pain. It is a problem of faith. So what will we do? So for me, what is the issue is, okay, I have to live with pain. I've prayed many times. A number of my friends still pray for me. I've stopped praying for healing. You say, why, Mark? Just keep praying. Maybe God will answer it on the 1,000 time versus the 999 time. Well, that's a topic for another seminar that we can do. But for now, I'm saying I'm okay because God says to Paul in 2 Corinthians is that my grace is sufficient, for my power or my grace is perfected in weakness. Somehow God has entrusted me with this suffering. Do I want it? No. Is it good? No. But he's entrusted me with it, and he's given me grace each day to deal with it. And I've been able to. I haven't missed work except for the surgeries. I've been able to continue to minister, which is the one thing that I fear, that if TN got too bad, I wouldn't even be able to talk. And that scares me because my life is the word, and I want to be able to do what God has equipped me to do. But each day it's counting on that grace that says, okay, God, you've allowed this into my life. You're God. And I know nothing that comes into my life doesn't pass through your hands first. So you must allow me to go through it, and you'll give me the grace to endure. Is it disappointing? Yes. Are there still moments of tears? Yes. Does it still hurt? Absolutely. But like Professor Gunn has said, I'm looking to that Revelation 21 time when he will wipe away every tear. This is not heaven. So I can't expect this world to be heaven. There'll be sin, there'll be suffering. And I don't think I'm suffering, TN, because of sin. It's just a sin-sick world that we live in. It's rough. Yes, it's terrible. And any of you going through chronic pain, you understand. It's sometimes a chore to get up and do the next thing. But the one thing that motivates me is Jesus may come back today. And if he came back today, I want him to find me faithful for what he has allowed. And if I blow it, if I give up, if I lower my view of God, that he's not God, if I do that today and Jesus comes back on Sunday, then I'm going to say, man, if I just made it 2 more days, I would have made it. I would have been faithful. He would have said, well done. So I have this in my mind. I want to be faithful to what God has allowed in my life and keep God in that position as God, and that nothing passes through his hands without him knowing it into my life first. So I can trust him, and he gives me the grace day by day to live with pain, because there's nothing they can do with nerve pain. There's no medication. There's not another surgery, because at where I am right now, they said they would have to go too far down in the brainstem to possibly get the issue. And that would just create other issues where I'd be drooling all the time, may lose my mind, and, I'd be a couch potato. And that's not what we would want at this level. So we deal with pain, but we're not alone, because as Dr. Slessor said, Jesus walks it with me, and every day he gives me his grace. But this idea of that view, that pain and suffering attacks our view of God, is the dynamic that we all have to understand.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone, for presenting tonight. I do appreciate that. We have a couple comments and questions that have come in. Just a personal one for you, Dr. McGinnis. Let's be honest, you were the one who punched that vending machine, right?
No, well, you didn't see that. I shook it a little bit.
Okay. We have a much more serious question than that. How long did it take you to realize you needed to increase your faith in God in this journey that you shared with us?
That's a good question. I've learned a few things. I always enjoyed the book of Job. And I've always preached the book of Job, because I think outside of salvation, how we deal with suffering is probably the second most important thing, because we're all going to deal with suffering. What I realized was that when I was sharing Job, and as my church and other churches where I spoke, I thought I was sharing it with people because they needed to hear. Really, God was preparing me for this journey myself. So it wasn't that I had to increase my faith and living through this dynamic just through regular pain. I mean, before I had TN, 3 years before, I was suffering with celiac disease. And I came home and my wife's crying. I came home from Bible study and my wife's at the table and she's crying. I'm saying, dear, why are you crying? She looks at me and says, you have celiac disease. I said, silly, what? I mean, I had lost 15 pounds in a month. She thought I was cancer and dying. So we had to deal with that and said, okay, we have to change your diet. And I said, how bad it can be? She said, no more Oreo cookies. I said, what? Maybe I should die. Maybe it's, it's not worth living without Oreos. So, you get through those type of things and I say, okay, God's still God. Okay, I'm going to trust him because he allowed this in my life. So I think God was preparing me for this. It just didn't come out of the blue.
Yeah. This idea of preparing, I think, is fitting in with a lot of where people are as they are asking questions. Someone has asked Dr. McGinnis again, if you would how would you counsel someone who's had a life-changing medical diagnosis and struggling that this may be the rest of their life journey?
Yeah, I wrote an article with the late Dr. Decker. He was diagnosed with cancer around the same time I was diagnosed with trigeminal. And we wrote an article because his was fatal. He was going to die from the cancer. I was not. So we wrote an article entitled, I'm not afraid to die, I am afraid to live. And we did that together because the reality is he was going to get an escape from his suffering. I was not. I know Feinberg and others say that the intellectual argument that Professor Gunn gave is not adequate. I disagree. I think it has to start there with the knowledge that we do live in this sin-sick world and this is not God's design. Then when we're given that chronic pain that's going to be with us forever until we die, the reality is this is where you have to go back to Job. And I have to deal with the God of Job 38-42. We have to be willing to live there and say, I'm going to believe the God of the Bible and not lower my view that God is not capable of sustaining me through this.
Yeah, that's great. We had some people ask about that article. Is there a way that we can find a link to that or share where people can access that?
That's a good question. Maybe David, maybe you know, because that was through Baptist Bulletin. So that was a number of years ago.
That was through the Baptist Bulletin. I have links right here. It's a two-part article. One of them is entitled "The Courage to Live." That ran on one side of the page by Dr. McGinnis. The other article was entitled "The Courage to Die" on the other side of the page by Dr. Decker. I will paste the links to those into the chat.
Yeah, and this is either good news or bad news, but someone has posted that there are now gluten-free Oreos. I don't know. That may be a work of the devil, not necessarily the work for the good of mankind. But this has been just a great response coming in these past few moments here, and a lot of people are very thankful for your testimony. And sorry, Professor McGinnis, you're going to be the star here of some of these questions. But someone has asked, you mentioned three things that Job questioned God about. You remember offhand what it was that you had said about that?
Yeah, his love, his justice, and his righteousness. Was he right? Did he love Job? Was he right in doing what he did to Job?
Excellent, excellent. And the link to the article is in the chat. So if you would like to click on that, you can access that. That should be free for everyone here.
Yeah, James, if I could just, there is a book, When Suffering is Redemptive. It tells, there's 10 stories in here about suffering from other believers. I was asked by Larry Waters, who was a professor at Dallas, to write this story with him because Larry was the one that suffers from cluster headaches. So he had the first pain, the worst pain known in medical science, and I had the second. Then he got 8 other authors to talk about their suffering. And Larry went home to be with the Lord before COVID because of his cluster headaches. But if you want to know more about my story and others, Johnny Erickson Tata wrote the foreword for the book and just what it's like. So if you're dealing with suffering, you want some other testimonies that others that are walking with Jesus through it, it would, you know, it's a good. So it's called When Suffering is Redemptive, edited by Larry Waters, and it's from Lexham Press.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. And Benjamin King has put that in the chat for Amazon. So if you wanted to take a look at it there, you can. And this will be an all play, and this might be our last question given the time constraints. But someone has asked, how crucial a role does suffering play in our spiritual transformation? So this is open for whoever would like to take that. I think this might fall more in line with Professor Gunn, but if anyone wants to jump in here, go right ahead.
Well, I don't know how you can possibly quantify it. How crucial a role does it play? 7 out of 10, 8 of 10, 6 out of 10. As finite humans with our relative perspective, we can never really assign it a weight or a number. But I think everyone would agree, or at least most Christian theologians would agree, that suffering does play an important role in our spiritual journey, in our sanctification. For that matter, it can play an important role in bringing someone to Christ in the first place, because suffering by its very existence bears this kind of silent testimony to the fact that this world is not the way it's supposed to be. And Lewis has been quoted tonight. If I could paraphrase him, he says something to the effect of, if I find within myself a longing for something that nothing in this world can fill, then I must conclude that I was designed for another world. I think in that sense, suffering can point us to Christ, both as an unbeliever and as a believer. There's another sense in which suffering, I think, plays into our spiritual journey, and that is understanding Christ's suffering, I think, gives us a glimpse into the heartbeat of God. We understand when we look at Jesus Christ suffering on the cross for our sins that God is not some kind of an aloof, uncaring deity. Rather, he cares very deeply for us, and he cares very deeply for our suffering. The apologist John Lennox has put it this way. I found this very profound. He says, If the Christian worldview is true, and I believe it is, then that means when we look at Christ hanging on the cross, we are looking at God hanging on the cross. And the immediate response to that from a rational human perspective has to be, what in the world is God allowing, what is he doing, allowing himself to be crucified? A lot of answers to that. The Bible provides a lot of answers to that. But one of the things that it highlights is that God has not chosen to remain distant from human suffering. Rather, he has chosen to become a part of human suffering. That he loved us so much that he chose to undergo suffering for our sake. And I think what that really highlights for me is the value of Christ's sacrifice and the fact that therefore we can trust him even when it's difficult to do so.
And if I can jump in a little, remember too, is we're talking about what part does suffering play in, spiritual life, spiritual living. For each person, it's different because it's that life circumstance that God is allowing you to deal with. And will you use his grace for whatever suffering that is, whether the suffering is temporary or whether the suffering is long-term or the suffering is going to be chronic. Wayne, what is that verse in 1 Peter 4, right? The one who suffers ceases from sin. That's a scary thought, right? That Jesus suffered, we suffer, and he who suffers ceases from sin. I mean, isn't it the Psalms that said, it's good that I was afflicted? Ugh, who wants to say that? It's good that I'm afflicted, I may not sin. Wow. We tend not to like suffering and pain.
Yeah. And I think, again, what Peter understands is the suffering that these recipients were going through was inevitable. So it was something that they were going to experience. So I think the letter specifically addresses the fact that, hey, let suffering happen because you are doing good. It's because you are actually living out your identity. And the more that you live out your identity, the more countercultural you will be. Therefore, it's coming. And I think that's why he says it twice. Happy are you, or you're a blessed one, because you are suffering for doing good. Your character is such, honorable, good, however you want to phrase that, in or within the society and within the community, that you are living godly, you're living rightly. So therefore it's coming. So I think, again, I don't know how to quantify it, like David said, but for sure, I think it's critical. Closer you move to God, the closer you are obviously to him, and the further you are away from culture. And that'll always bring about something.
Okay, well, I really appreciate your feedback, professors, and just the work that you've put into this, and being willing to share what you've studied, what the scripture teaches, the hope that can be ours. And Professor McGinnis, your transparency was just wonderful. Thank you for that. I want to thank you for everyone for coming and being a part of this. We have a link that we are going to send to everyone here. We do have a couple of people who asked questions about BBS and CSU as far as getting more information about the school. And if you do have any questions about that, you can follow up on the link there. But we do want to thank you for coming and joining us tonight. Pray that this was a blessing for you, and have a wonderful evening.